Welcome to part one of your trauma-informed care training for Tides Family Services. My name is Dr. Kalina Brayback. I will be doing part one of your training, and my colleague, Dr. Christina Tortolani, will be doing part two. I am a faculty member in the mental health counseling program at Rhode Island College. I'm a licensed psychologist, and I have a clinical practice through Lifespan where I primarily work with people who have been impacted by trauma. I always start training on trauma and trauma-informed care with a disclaimer, and that is to remind us that as we will review, trauma is very ubiquitous. It is very prevalent, and that means it's not only prevalent among the people we work with, but it's also prevalent among those of us who provide services. So, as you're going through the material today, you may find that your own histories may interact with the information that's presented, and so I encourage you to, as needed, take the steps that are required to take care of yourselves, whether that be taking a break, engaging in self care, or processing with a supportive friend. Just be aware of how you might be getting activated by some of this material and take the steps needed to care for yourself as you go through this. We are building on the objectives for trauma informed care that are defined by SAMHSA, and these are our specific objectives for our training. I've bolded here the ones that are going to be more emphasized today, but overall, our objectives are to understand conceptually a holistic approach to trauma and its care, to appreciate the impact of trauma on a client's functioning across domains, to recognize through the assessment process those impacted by trauma, to utilize accurate empathy and empowerment to those impacted by trauma, to develop and utilize the core principles of trauma-informed care, to appreciate the role of culture, diversity, and gender in service provision, and to recognize the impact of trauma on comorbid mental health issues, including substance use. And this is just a general breakdown of how we will go through the training today. We'll begin by spending time defining trauma and trauma-informed care. And as part of that, we will look at the way in which trauma is embedded within systems of oppression, and we'll examine intergenerational and historical trauma as parts of the traumatic experiences that our clients may present with. And then the second half will be spent trying to understand the way that trauma impacts us. There are a couple of main points that I want to make sure to highlight right at the forefront and to encourage us to keep in mind as we go through the training. First of all, to practice from a trauma-informed approach, we are doing a fundamental shift in our perspective away from what's wrong with you and toward what's happened to you and how did you learn to survive that. And secondly, and in a related way, what we call symptoms or problem behaviors or personality flaws can be understood as initially being adaptations to traumatic events. And as we'll learn, the very ways in which we develop solutions that allow us to survive traumatic events can themselves become the problems over time, particularly as trauma gets triggered in the present moment. I'm going to encourage you to follow this hyperlink here under number 3, which really underscores the ways in which healing happens in relationships. And I think this short video gives a really nice way of thinking about the power of empathy and how it's different from sympathy or pity and far more powerful.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here. And you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no. You want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with "at least." Yeah. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
So we will now start to define trauma and trauma-informed care. We will begin with defining trauma and looking at different types of trauma. We will then look at how trauma is embedded within systems of oppression. We will look at the ACEs study, which really changed the way in which we understand how early adverse experiences impact our health and mental health throughout our lifetime. We'll briefly look at some prevalence rates that underscores just how prevalent trauma is, and then we'll finish with defining trauma-informed care. Decades of work in the field of trauma have generated multiple definitions of trauma, and we will start with looking at a few different ways that we can come to a mutual understanding of what do we mean by trauma. We might start with the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, 5th edition's definition of trauma. The DSM defines a traumatic event as one that involves exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence in one or more of the following ways. So it could be directly experienced, it could be witnessed as it occurred to others, it could be learning that it had happened to someone that was close to you, and it could be experiencing repeated extreme exposures to aversive details of traumatic events. Usually that happens in the context of one's professional duties, like first responders or police officers. While the DSM gives us a very clear-cut definition for what a traumatic event might be. There are some events that have long-lasting changes on our psychological well-being and that temporarily overwhelm our capacity to cope that may not be adequately captured by that more narrow DSM definition. If you think, for example, about someone who experiences sexual abuse in which there was no violent coercion, or perhaps someone who experienced extreme neglect or domestic violence that wasn't life threatening and yet was a constant risk presence in one's life. So we can look at some other definitions of trauma that perhaps are clinically a little bit more useful. Judith Herman, who is one of our country's leading experts on trauma and abuse and wrote the seminal book Trauma and Recovery, emphasizes how trauma causes us to shift our beliefs, particularly around safety. She says that traumatic events overwhelm, challenge, and question people's expectations of their safety and of how the world works. SAMHSA defines trauma as an event or series of events or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. SAMHSA emphasizes the 3 E's of trauma: event, experience, and effects. The focus on events places the causes of trauma in the environment and not some defect in the individual. Again, it's not what's wrong with you, but what's happened to you. And an event may be a single episode or may be a repeated and chronic event. The focus of experience highlights the fact that not every child or adult will experience the same events as traumatic. One's subjective experience and response depends on many factors, including age, whether supportive others are present, the cultural context, the ability to find meaning in what's happening, and one's previous experiences. The identification of a broad range of potential effects, the 3rd E, reminds us that our response must be holistic. It's not enough to just focus on symptoms or behaviors. We want to support children and adults to move into satisfying lives, or what we might call, in the words of Marsha Linehan, the founder of DBT, a life worth living. There's a very wide range of events that might potentially cause trauma. This includes things that might have happened early in childhood and perhaps an individual doesn't even remember. Includes events that are well-intentioned and necessary and yet traumatic, like medical procedures. It can include an event that didn't happen to the person but to a group that he or she closely identifies with. This would be historical trauma, as in the case of slavery or the Holocaust or the genocide of Native American people. And it could also include chronic stressors that over time can accumulate to cause trauma. One way that we might categorize different kinds of experiences is as those that involve primarily abuse, like domestic violence, those that involve primarily loss, like abandonment, those that involve primarily living with chronic stressors, like racism, or poverty, or having a family member with a severe mental illness or substance use disorder. And of course, some experiences, for example, domestic violence, may fall within 3 categories. In the case of domestic violence, you have exposure to abuse, but then you may have to leave your home and go with mom to live in a shelter which means a loss of my school and of my home. And that may also mean that mom is now financially unstable and so on. Now I'm also living with the chronic stressor of poverty. It's also helpful to think about what distinguishes between normal or regular stress, toxic stress, and trauma. Stress is anything that life brings our way that has the potential to upset our balance or homeostasis. With stress, a certain amount is tolerable and even serves a positive purpose in motivating our behavior. If you're stressed for an exam, you're going to prepare for that exam. So it can be very adaptive. Now, of course, when stress is ongoing and not properly managed, it can affect our mental and physical health. But typically, a certain amount of stress is a normal part of our experience and can actually motivate our behavior in important ways. And after the stressful event is removed or the stressor is removed, we go back to balance. With adversity, a person experiences levels of intense or toxic stress in which there's this overactivation of the stress response system, and a person has a hard time coming back to a state of equilibrium or balance. The stressor, instead of being removed, like I took the test and now it's done, is just ongoing and it's constantly there. So that might be experiences like living in poverty, living with racial discrimination and racism, managing a chronic illness, caring for a loved one who has a mental illness or substance use disorder. And these kinds of adverse experiences that are chronic in nature can be particularly damaging when they happen to children outside the presence of a supportive adult or caregiver who might buffer those effects. And over time, exposure to these chronic stressors can be traumatic. Finally, at the end of the continuum, we have trauma. With trauma, the stress has far overwhelmed our capacity to cope and to endure, and there is no off button. Unlike stress, which is normal, trauma is never normal, and there is no return to balance. Healing and recovery take a long time. So we're now going to move to our second objective, which is to distinguish between types of trauma, type 1 and type 2. Type 1 trauma is a single or discrete incident. So some examples could include a motor vehicle accident, a natural disaster, a single incident sexual assault, or single incident physical assault. Type 2 trauma is prolonged and repeated exposure to traumatic events. Type 2 trauma, when it involves traumatic events perpetrated by other people, particularly people that are within the primary support group, and involves a fundamental betrayal of primary relationships. This is called complex trauma. And when that occurs in childhood and disrupts development and the acquiring of developmental capacities or competencies, it's called developmental trauma. So examples might be neglect, domestic violence, sexual and physical abuse. Of course, a person could have a mixture of type 1 and type 2 trauma. Type 1 and type 2 do tend to present clinically somewhat differently. Type 1 trauma tends to manifest more akin to what we would expect from the DSM's PTSD definition. So someone who's having re-experiencing symptoms like flashbacks or nightmares, avoidance symptoms like trying to block certain thoughts or memories or avoiding things that remind them of the traumatic event. Hyperarousal symptoms like feeling constantly on edge or vigilant of their surroundings, and negative alterations in cognitions and mood. So, thoughts like maybe the world is not safe, or um, I can't rely on other people, emotions like anger or perhaps guilt or self blame. Type 2 trauma may involve many of those classic symptoms from PTSD, but also can manifest with significant difficulties in emotion regulation, so both controlling emotions and also managing distressing affective states without using impulsive behaviors as a way of managing them. So, for example, cutting or substance use. Type 2 trauma tends to correlate with impulsive behaviors like self injurious behaviors, substance use, eating disorder behaviors. It tends to correlate with very disruptive interpersonal challenges, high conflict in relationships, difficulty trusting others, difficulty sustaining relationships. It tends to correlate with a more detached sense of self. Often, people with a lot of um, exposure to type 2 trauma may present in a hypo-aroused state where they're emotionally feel very empty, very disconnected from their experiences, and they may engage in a lot of dissociation.